I always wanted to write for a popular audience. One of my ambitions, which will forever remain unrealised, is to write a book which will be sold on station bookstores. And I thought I'd hit it when I went to China and came back and wrote a book, which we might talk about later, but wasn't as successful as that. Anyhow, after the trumpet shall sound, it swiftly became. I applied, as I'd earlier mentioned, I think to Cambridge. There was nothing. There were no posts in those days. It's like now.
Meyer had. Well, he'd been there a few years, not very long, and it was slowly expanding.
Very slowly. Like the odd post every few years or something.
Yes.
So it was quite clear, not only there were very few posts, but Max finally put the blunt truth to me one day and said, you know, with your political reputation, you're not going to get a job in anthropology. I said, Max, you're quite right. So that's when I started trying various other possibilities, including studying schizophrenics at the Worsley, and thank God I didn't. He said, well, you should switch to sociology, which was just beginning to lift itself then. I said, all right, and I think probably the first job I applied for at Hull, with a very strong competition from Andrzejewski, a very good guy from the United States, Henry Landsberger, demographer and Latin Americanist, Paul Halmosh, who later became Professor of Social Administration at Kiel, and I can't think who else. They picked me out. I don't know why, because an anthropologist had been studying, it probably helped that I think, no, by that time my book had not been published. I'd done a broadcast on the BBC, on the third programme, on cargo cults. And that broadcast came out about 2 days before the interview. And it may have perhaps turned them. The other guys are proper sociologists, I was not. So I then spent the next hard few months trying to read enough sociology to keep 2 hours ahead of the students. I really knew very, very little. And I taught them a lot of anthropology under a course called Comparative Social Structures. We were working to the London External BSc in Social Sciences at the time. And I had a very good young colleague, Gordon Horobin, and together we slowly built up very good popular courses. Then sociology started to explode, and so did the universities, of course, with the Robbins Report. And we had a huge department. And I don't know how many people we had there by the time I finished there in '64.
You went there in
56. I was there 8 years in Hull. Very big department, quite prestigious. Some people thought well of it.
And you were head of it?
I was head of it. Eventually became senior lecturer. And about a year before I left there, Max had managed to get Manchester to approve of a chair in sociology, which they hadn't had. I went for interview, and so did other people, and didn't hear a thing. I got a phone call informally from Max saying, well, they decided not to appoint, so we're going to wait and see. So I didn't want to leave for all kinds of personal reasons at that time. I was quite happy at Hull. And about 1 year later, out of the blue, I got a letter from the Vice-Chancellor Manchester saying, you have been appointed. I thought, thank you very much, I haven't even been asked. But of course I went. I was really too good to be true. A major university like Manchester, that I knew well, and great love for. Wonderful. And I was a Northwesterner as well. So I went, and the expansion of the universities and of sociology was exponential, which produced great problems sooner rather than later with Max himself, because he had thought he could control this as a kind of junior ancillary wing of his empire. And firstly, I don't like to be treated like that by anybody. Secondly, he did really try to restrict the amount of sociology that was made available, and conversely to stipulate that all students would have anthropology whether they liked it or not. And sooner or later it came to a sort of territorial battle, you know. It was really very sad. And a lot of hostility between anthropology and sociology, and we of course won because we were the subject in demand. more or less won, and we went from strength to strength, so much so that after a few years the dean of the faculty came to me and he said, "Peter, we just can't go on like this. We can't have a faculty who's going to be 60% sociologists." A very distinguished economics department, large economic department with possibly nothing to do with all that. So I said, "No, you can't, it's ludicrous." And we put a ceiling on sociology. Later, Mrs. Thatcher put a ceiling on sociology, so that problem solved itself. At least the student revolution put a ceiling on sociology. So there I was sitting with a large department, and
who else was there then? It was Brian Robertson.
Brian came fairly soon. The situation was so desperate with the Robbins expansion. There were what, I think at least around 10 new universities in a year. I was getting phone calls at Hull, and later, even after I'd moved to Manchester, would I like to move to X, Y, Z and several other places. I said, "No, I've only just moved here. And in any case, I like it here. A lot of potential." I was reduced to the situation once. I had a new post in sociology available. I mean, in those days, the Vice Chancellor would give you what they call a couple of honeymoon posts. He'd say, "Here's a couple of posts, fill them." Just to, with the kind of people you interest to, well, I want to support. I rang round a lot of universities. I said, "Have you got anybody, a warm body, intelligent, remotely capable of teaching sociology?" And it was jolly difficult to find anybody. Eventually I found, Jelly Halsey said, "Yes, I've got this brilliant young PhD back from Chicago called Brian Roberts," and he turned out to be jolly good.
Mm.
Later converted himself into a Latin Americanist.
Mm.
We had Valdo Pons, of course, also came from anthropology, had an anthropological background.
When did Theodore?
Theodore came a few years later. Do you want me to talk about Theodore?
Yes, I gave a sly smile there.
Well, I had a letter one day from him. He was at the Russian Centre at either Birmingham or Sheffield, I think. Got a letter saying, "I am very interested in peasant studies and also a specialist on Russia." By that time, I'd been sent out in 1965, a year after I got to Manchester. The only time I've ever been recruited by the establishment through a rather radical person who's now gone off to Harvard. What is his name? Economist. Recommended me as a man with a knowledge of East Africa, anthropology and so forth, for a British Economic Commission on which was connected to a project to give Tanzania a lot of money, aid. So being Tanzania, I agreed. And somehow, I don't know, my political past was regarded as tolerable anyhow. And I went out there and wrote a report, and I got interested in cooperatives. I was studying particularly the predecessors of what became the cooperative farms and eventually the Ujamaa collectives, which are a disastrous story. So were the ones I was studying, were disastrous. So I developed, however, an interest in cooperatives, rural development. And because of that, what? Oh yes, I wrote a book. I participated with Ron Dahl in staging a conference at Sussex IDS on cooperatives in the Third World and development. I wrote a long introduction to it, and that drew the attention of Theodore, who was one of the participants. And so he wrote to me and said, "I'd like to come talk to you." And I thought, oh my God, I don't talk to some white Russian emigre who's going to blow down my ear about the horrors of communism and the horrors of collectivization, which I was by that time thoroughly aware of. So I wrote back saying something like, "I'm terribly busy," It didn't make any difference to Theodore, because the door flew open one day, practically off its hinges, and he said, "I have come!" And this 6-foot figure, not only with this tremendous personality, impressed, but he taught me more in the next 2 hours about peasants in the world than I'd ever thought of in the whole of my life. Brilliant! So then I read his thesis, and I became a kind of backer of Theodore, patron. Got it. We helped to get it. I think he got it published. The Awkward Class. I think he got it published. I don't think we did. But I got involved through him in peasant studies, and he and I together did a lot of work on editing, though I don't speak Polish, some Polish writings on peasants and peasant change of peasant society in Poland by Galensky. And then eventually the possibility of a chair, a second chair, arose at Manchester, and he became one of the candidates, and I don't want to go into all the details of the vicissitudes, but he won it. And so that's how Theodore came to Manchester, on his merits.
He's always remained that overwhelmingly larger-than-life character.
Oh, I was just in Brazil recently, and there seem to be two subjects of conversation. One is the terrible effect, the shock that everyone was experiencing of 2,000% inflation, and the second was the visit of Theodore Shining. Yes, he's a great guy.
At what point did you'd gone to Manchester, where was it that you wrote The Third World?
I wrote that in my last couple of years at Hull. In fact, I did the index to the thing in the first week I was at Manchester, sitting in a little squalid room, sent it off, and they lost it. And I had to, in the middle of the first week of term, a new post, starting a new department, I had to sit down and write out a new index. De novo, because I hadn't kept a copy. So I wrote it there. It was published just after I arrived in Manchester. It was published in '64. I arrived in Manchester in '64. So, you know, it's quite good to have a new book, well reviewed by like Shills and The Guardian. And that made me a third world man. In fact, the third world man, with all modesty. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the French had invented it. And that took me really... I remember talking to the director of, was it Nigel Nicholson? At Weidenfeld. And I said something which I think was quite modest about the book. I said, people do seem to have found it interesting when I give them talks about this in seminars around Britain. He said, you will travel all over the world with this book. And I thought, my heavens, I dreamed of anything like that, and it turned out to be true.
You said it's been translated into...
Well, I know there are at least 8 editions in Mexico alone.
Good.
Mainly South America, because that's where you've got a large literate tertiary education population. And of course it's read in English in places like India and so forth. Never got translated to French. I mean, the barrier between us and Paris is still intellectual barrier, absolutely alarming. You know, that's one of the things I resented about the later developments in New Left Review. They worshipped everything on the South Bank. The latest emanations were Althusser or Derrida. I don't. And only very recently I've had a translation to French of Trumpet Shall Sound. Not of anything else, ever. Nor have I ever received an invitation to speak in France. Nor Germany, for that matter. I've been all over the third world, largely as a result of that book.
How would you reconcile those two things, that it was in France that it was discovered? It was Guru, was it, or who was it who put forward the idea of the three worlds?
It was a Politico, it was Claude Bourdet. The term was coined by Alfred Sauvy, who was a demographer. I'm not sure, did he get a Nobel Prize? But he was a very distinguished one. He coined it in '52, and it became taken up and used in French political circles that I was associated with. That's how I probably read about it ahead of anybody else in England, because those early New Left days we had our opposite numbers in France. The whole concept of the democratic left was analogous to that old Trotskyite slogan, neither Moscow nor Washington, but more positive. We want to stand for democratic socialism, radical democratic socialism. And Claude Bourdet of the Nouvel Observateur, editor, whom I met on various occasions, also through CND, international things, took up the notion of tiers-monde, and I learned about this concept from the French. And it seemed to make sense of something new entity that was forming under our eyes. And by 1955, of course, we had the Bandung non-aligned conference. There had been a whole series of predecessors and postecessors. It was a new... the publishers put on the cover of my Third World book, I didn't put it on a subtitle saying, "A Vital New Force in International Affairs." I wouldn't have made anything quite as strident as that out of it, but they did, and I think they're right, because that's how we saw it at the time, and it was. It was an extremely important breakthrough. Immensely important, even in merest terms of the masses of population involved. You know, India, China, Nehru, Nasser, and Nkrumah, and the connections that were being made to even through to Europe with Tito, and even to Britain with Naurin Bevan used to go and talk to Tito and Nehru, and they had known each other a long time. A new force in the world seemed to be taking place, and I guess I was so excited about it, although I hope I've documented it intellectually carefully enough, that some of that must have communicated itself certainly to many, many people who said to me, "Oh, we read this at UNAM in Mexico and it really changed my life," and that's rather encouraging.
How do you write? Was it written in a great sort of burst of
steam
in a short period? It was just sudden.
A couple of vacations, I think, from one summer vacation through the next one, and in other vacations, and in between. It was written white heat.
Do you work like that?
Philip Larkin told me that. He says a very passionate book.
That's nice. You just, once you start writing, you like to just...
If I got something really, yes. I don't really like to write unless I got something to say. I don't write like people have to these days, and Americans seem to do it all too often anyhow, simply to fill up their CVs. It's a great tragedy. I mean, the publish or perish syndrome. The rubbish is churned out exponentially. No, I write when I got something to say. Now at the moment I think I can feel the germs. It's like a kind of sexual itch.
Yes.
Oh, another book coming up inside. I thought I'd stopped, but I can see another one coming because I feel I've got something to say.
Well, you, at some point in your magnum opus, The Three Worlds, you sort of imply this is your life's work and this is the last thing, but it sounds as if it is.
Well, I thought I'd said everything there. But do you want me to talk about it?
Well, let's just finishing the Third World. You've sort of reflected retrospectively on other things and suggested ways in which you would alter. I know you were encouraged to rewrite it, and after one re-edition, you then decided you couldn't because things had changed too much.
Yeah.
What had changed? You said you yourself had changed, the world had changed, and the Third World had changed. What was it really that changed and made?
Well, that great non-aligned movement died back. It still persists and exists, but in much attenuated and restricted form. There is, and I've had first-hand experience of it, a very vital presence of the more radical Third World, and it now embraces not only the radicals, but really every country, in the form of the non-aligned group in the United Nations in Manhattan, about 125 of them. And they are a significant presence there. Jean Kirkpatrick used to go crazy because Americans can't control the UN anymore. Even the Third World can do it on its own. They can get a vote through, but if they get a few allies from the Second World bloc, which they often can on crucial issues, then they're home and dry. Then, of course, nothing happens because it can be either positively vetoed or just ignored. No funds provided. But it is important. But I think, whereas it was a political force, I mean, therefore it is stymied at the UN. There's very little it can do. It can exert moral pressure. And I've seen empty meetings at UN myself on Namibia, which I've been one of the 4 people in the audience in the council chamber. So one shouldn't exaggerate how important those victories are at UN. But in 1964, of course, it became rapidly apparent, and people like Nyerere have said, you know, they came to power thinking that they were going to change the economy and lift their people up and give them decent standards of living. And so he said we hadn't the slightest idea. We hadn't got an economic program. We thought we could do without an army too. And then we found Idi Amin. He said we had no idea of the power of the great multinational corporations and our impotence to control world prices for our raw materials, our exports. And he said that increasingly we found out. And so that by 1964, the political independence of most of the African countries only won in 60-61, 2 or 3 years before. They soon found out they couldn't do anything. In fact, in many ways, getting worse. I remember citing the instance of Ghana doubling its cocoa production at the time when prices went down by half. So they're exactly where they started, having worked twice as hard, twice as effectively. So they began seeing the problem as one of an economic one, of global market, and of the power of the transnational corporations. And that's the point in 1964, from the first UNCTAD conference onwards, that the non-aligned increasingly saw that what held them in common was all that plus debt. And therefore became predominantly a movement of resistance, a lot of it verbal, to the economic hegemony of the West. And the West particularly, rather than the Second World, didn't matter all that much. So, and that's what it remains to this day. So those are the only, it's a very significant shift. But I think that's basically what's happened to the Third World today.
That's why it was not worth bringing out new editions of the book, because it had shifted in this way.
Yes, and of course, you know, I mean, the events of formative period in the 50s and 60s become more and more remote. You can't go on writing. So I waited a long time, you see. I valued my time, and also I felt I hadn't done a good enough intellectual job. It was a very pioneering operation, mental shoestrap operation. I mean, my chapter on nationalism was not very good at all. And so I just sat down and gradually equipped myself, I guess. I did all this work on the rural Third World, agrarian Third World, helped much by Theodore, and Brian introduced me to Latin America. Eventually I got, after 14 agonizing years, never getting a chance to to be away from Manchester for more than a few weeks. Couldn't have done any anthropological, sustained work, extended work. I was then sentenced to being dean for 2 years, which is a final degradation and rendering of sterility of any intellectual, though I quite enjoyed it. And I got a year off. And I decided that I write about the Third World. I knew about Africa, and I knew something about Asia from my Indian days. But I knew nothing about South America. So I took myself off to Ecuador under the influence of one of my postgraduate students, learned myself Spanish, and that opened a new world, a new dimension. And of course there you've got a very rich intellectual tradition, the literature, sociological literature from Chile, and Argentina and Brazil. The Southern Cone was enormous before the dictators came along. And one met all those refugees all over the place, in Mexico and in Ecuador. Mexico has a hugely impressive anthropological tradition. It goes back to the days of indigenismo in the 30s, the revolution. It's a revolutionary tradition, heritage. And so I learned that you didn't need to... that all these theories about Gunder Frankenstein, about underdevelopment or revolution, that postulated precisely that there could not be no development in the Third World, which at first I rather naively swallowed like everybody else. I used to go choking to work in Mexico City from the car fumes and the industrial pollution, and I say to myself, underdevelopment? Or in Sao Paulo, or in Rio, where blue canyons of smoke from the patent development of an industrial kind. So I started to research and to read about this industrial development in Mexico and Brazil, and by that time, having Spanish and Portuguese, I could do it.
You learned Portuguese as well?
Yeah. So that equipped me on the industrial front. Agrarian, industrial, but I remain deep down in my fibres an anthropologist, and I'm never happy about the totality which purports to resource the world of sociological or economic or other theories, and I'm interested in the cultural, and that's ultimately where I came more and more back to it through most unlikely people like Marshall Salins, was a big influence.
Which that was
Oh,
Culture
particularly.
and practical reason.
Yeah, culture and practical reason, particularly, yes.
Which you say has never been answered by
I
Marxists.
don't think they've answered it. I've read a long piece, I remember in Dialectical Anthropology by Bridget McLaughlin. I don't think it takes Marshall for pieces at all. Because I don't think you can. And so I came back and I read a lot about culture, including the conceptualization of culture. I went back to old works that Cliff Geertz had written in 1940 and all kinds of things. And I think he mystifies it, absolutizes it, reifies it. Now that was also unsatisfactory, but at least recognizes its importance and its persistence. So that's why that theme occurs so powerfully in Three Worlds, which didn't in the Third World, except implicitly.
Perhaps if we turn to the Three Worlds, which is obviously a summation, at least when you wrote it you thought it was a summation of all your wisdom. There were three in the prolegomena anyway. There were four things that I wondered whether you could, themes that interested me particularly. One was your criticism, we've talked about a little bit, the criticism of world system theory, Wallerstein. What was it that, was it the case of something which at first you found terribly refreshing and exciting and overwhelming, and then you began to doubt it, or were you doubtful?
Yes, I'm very attracted by it. I think anyone must be. Patently, a world system has emerged. Since at least 1885, I think, that's about the date of its consolidation. Clearly, even in the communist world, prices of consumer goods and all kinds of commodities are affected by what happens in Chicago, New York, and the commodity exchanges and the shares that are being sold down in the city here or in Manhattan. In that sense, it can't be controverted. But the crunch came for me in an actual concrete occasion. We're in Berlin, where I'm going to do the same thing in a few months' time. And Andre Gunder Frank, who I know well, and Manuel Wallerstein were there up on the platform with me. And somebody entitled the symposium One World or Three. At least that was the title of my paper. Now, of course, I took the line, there were three. And Gunder, amongst this huge audience of radical young German students, said, "Peter," he said, "you've got it just 100% arse about face." And maybe it was a bit of pique, but I didn't think intellectually I was wrong. And therefore I went home from Berlin and I read Wallerstein through, comma by comma, everything I could lay hands on. And I decided I would write what it seemed to be saying, because it's quite difficult to grasp him actually, and write a critique of it, what I thought was wrong with it. And I did that and published it in the Socialist Register. It's interesting. Minimal response. Zero response from Emmanuel, whom I love dearly as a friend and a politico, but I'm still unconvinced about the validity of this model. It's damn sight better than Gunder Frank's model, which is simply bipolar and postulates an equally antinomian set of choices under development or revolution. One might have argued revolution was a serious one in the days when there had been the Chinese Revolution and the Vietnamese, which defeated the most powerful country in human history, but not lately. In fact, counter-revolution's been doing quite well, thank you. So Wallerstein's model is much better insofar as it has core, the unit building blocks, core, periphery, but also semi-periphery. And it recognizes the possibility of transition from one status to another. Now, getting back to that pollution in Mexico City and Rio, I'd also been to Hong Kong and have been again recently, absolutely shattered at the transformation in 16 years. You've got to ask yourself the question, is this the third world anymore? And I don't think it is in Hong Kong, of course not. But there are a lot of countries which are also labelled nowadays newly industrializing. The four little tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore, and in South America, Mexico and Brazil, to name no others. Now, so impressive has their performance been, although the vulnerability of the Brazilian economy is considerable, given their massive debt, and Mexican, that someone like Nigel Harris writes a book for Penguins entitled The End of the Third World. And I still think it exists. I think it's a bit premature, like Mark Twain's death. At first I began to think, well, am I behind the times? I started reading about the new International Division of Labour, which German writers and others have written about. And going to Hong Kong, I was able to pick up and refresh myself on what's been happening. Jeffrey Henderson's wonderful book on the semiconductor industry in Hong Kong, which is coming out shortly. And yes, there's a new International Division of Labour. Yes, many of these newly industrializing countries are no longer any meaningful criterion third world. They're not agrarian, certainly. Dependency, we could argue about. That, I think, is wildly exaggerated. To all countries are interdependent to some degree or other, and dependent. So, nevertheless, I don't find it satisfactory to assume the third world has disappeared. Now, this is a sleight of hand. Out of the entire spectrum of countries which could be designated or have been designated third world, such as those that are in the World Bank's annual reports, you pick 6 that have indeed industrialized themselves and become export platforms and so forth. And you assume that this is the wave of the future for everywhere. At least it's implicit, but never perhaps explicit in Nigel Harris or other people. That's a hell of an assumption. Intellectually, one can make that kind of argument. Then practically, I thought, by pure coincidence, I went to Latin America again recently. And when I got to Peru, I realized it wasn't just an intellectual conviction, that Peru is a very different kettle of fish indeed. In fact, it's a broken back society, and I don't think it's going to last very long, with tremendous problems, which are those of the third world, and that there's absolutely no imminent logic that will take it in the direction of even Mexico. Yes, these countries have to a degree diversified themselves, a greater sized manufacturing sector and so forth and so on. But in crucial ways, they are exhibit the syndrome that we've always talked about as of dependent development or underdevelopment. Now, Black Africa is going backwards in the conventional terms of measurement of development. All the indices would show a 6% decrease in the value of African exports in the last few years. It's being dropped off as a kind of basket case by the West, which doesn't really care a damn about Black Africa. Now, you've worked in Nepal, and you know that there are the World Bank distinguishes between poor, middling poor, and very poor, or poorest, and there are degrees of poverty. And there are still large numbers of countries in those categories. And that's objectively speaking. That's our intellectual perception of them, if you like. They too see themselves still as third world. That's why they belong to the non-aligned grouping. And so, without beating around the bush too long, I still think that there is a significantly sized world, a third world still. And that to that extent, any immanentist models like that of Harris, or models that, I don't know what Emmanuel would argue about these things, but it's much more unclear. Any immanentist models are just fatuous.
Would you think that your reaction to Wallerstein and the fact that you are both concerned with the global economy spreading from the West and also the native perceptions and the way they shaped and altered it is something to do with the fact that you've been an anthropologist and you've been at the receiving end and watched the way small societies and bigger societies shape what hits them? So you do.
Absolutely. I mean, these are very brilliant people like Emmanuel Wallerstein. Most scholarly, perceptive, experienced, all kinds of things. They've never been exposed to that, really, though. I mean, I worked with a society, it wasn't even the whole society of 450 people, it was about 250 that I was allowed to study. And that's difficult, because it's a rich culture. And so I have been regressing, if you like, to my original interests. And I now think it's extremely important, yes, to be aware of Hong Kong, but also to be aware that the people in Hong Kong are Chinese. They have a culture too, and it certainly isn't that of Western Europe, nor are their values, as many studies bring out. They're also that China has a very different kind of ideology. Chinese, though they may be, they're also overlaid with quite a history now of communist ideology. And that's all going to be. So ideologies, cultural value systems, do not either correspond one-to-one with contemporary social structures. They also persist, they get transformed, but they exist. And they exist and have to be therefore taken into account in addition to political structures and economic institutions. Now, most political scientists and economists have absolutely no understanding what the hell on earth one means by all the relevance of cultural institutions and value systems. They wouldn't even begin to know how to go about understanding them. It doesn't enter their intellectual universe. And I think it's about time we stop this nonsense. And I want to go back now and write a book about other knowledges. And I don't know exactly what form it's going to take now, but it's going to be profoundly influenced by my dear missionary colleague, Dr. Waddy, whom I've never met. And we'll talk about Australian Aboriginal, as a type case study, Australian Aboriginal knowledge, or knowledge is plural, types of knowledge they have about the natural world around them. I'd like to talk about knowledge of the world beyond this world that most of us in a secular culture don't believe in. It exists, but it's real to people who believe in it and have most elaborate and sophisticated, involuted indeed, ideas about it. I'd like to talk about a fascinating study I read recently about the procedures used by Micronesian islanders to navigate across the wastes of the Pacific. How the hell they do it? What is their knowledge of the stars, of the heavenly bodies, and what techniques do they use, which is extremely sophisticated and acute and perceptive. And in general relate that to this very much wider theme that you touched upon about the necessity to understand how other peoples, including peoples that you normally get labelled primitive or underdeveloped or illiterate or pre-literate and so on, their cultures are extremely complex and persist, but also that's an extreme, these tiny microcultures. There are gigantic cultures that persist, like Iranian Islam or Chinese-ness, whatever that might be, which you've got to come to terms with. And I don't think that China eventually quarrelled with their loyalist allies and their supporters, the Soviet Union, is simply a question of differences of Marxist ideology. It's got something to do, too, with the nature of the difference between Russian-dominated society and culture and Chinese society and culture.
Can I lead on from that to another theme in the book? I remember Ernest Gellner either writing or saying to me that Marx has been replaced by Weber as the leading world sociologist. He probably put it more elegantly than that, but there is a sort of one part of the Prolegomena which stresses how, having abandoned a sort of base superstructure, determinist model, then one turns with relief to Weber, a sort of, and reads him again and finds that somehow he's managed to link things, and as all anthropologists want to do, see some holism, some connections, without forcing the mind to go in one direction or another. Is that what you find in Weber? Or?
That's what's attractive about him. Incredible genius. One hesitates to dare criticize him, but he raises the problem of Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. There's some kind of relationship between these two historical processes, the emergence of each respectively, and what the devil is the nature of the relationship. All kinds of commentaries have been written and criticisms of the way he went about it, methodologically, empirically, and so forth. How did he identify, select, categorize the Protestant ethic on the basis of what? Text by Baxter and Puritan divines and so on. What's the relation between that and, say, existential popular Protestantism in Geneva? There are all kinds of problems, but he raised the problematic. Marx was aware of it too. There are bits tucked away in his little letters and things, but it wasn't central. The logic of capital was what he talked about, talking about production. And that isn't enough. So whatever shortcomings Weber might have, and whatever differences there are in the works and the emphases that the late Weber and the early Weber wrote about on this topic, which is quite considerable, I think the problematic is that he had the genius to raise it, and no one can evade it.
Yes. Which again links him with the other theme, which is the cultural. I mean, obviously I wondered whether it was you were thinking it. I mean, trying to explain why there's obviously a rapid shift going on in your own mind and your own heart, and it's partly encapsulated there. But talking to you, I can see it's going faster and faster away from economic determinism and early interpretations of Marxism towards a much more interest in ideas, aesthetics, cultural influences, perceptions, and all these things. Now, it could be related to your anthropological streak. It could be related to your early schooling and education, history and English, which were the subjects you first studied. It could be that the world again is changing, and we can see much more clearly now the influence of culture. I mean, anyone who isn't aware now of the enormous influence of communications, of art, of symbolic systems as portrayed in the media, of photography, of film, of all these sort of cultural things, as well as religion, would be blind. It may not have been so obvious 10 years ago, but it's hitting us in the face. Which of those, do you think it's all those?
Well, I think all those are significant, but I think probably the most, perhaps you didn't mention it explicitly, is firstly Marxism itself, which I was cleaved to in my former reincarnation, has experienced disastrous pluralization. I don't think you can talk about Marxism now. You can only talk about Marxism's plural. There are many varieties, national varieties, Chinese, Soviet, and so forth. And one could classify Marxisms in other ways. I distinguish between Promethean ones, which set out to change the world, and determinist ones that simply regard the world as a place that is determined by the logic of the economy. All kinds of other ways. And these are not just distinctions I make. There are distinctions out there in the world that are battled over, subjects of causes, bases of tremendous struggles, intellectual struggles and political struggles. People kill each other to take one side or the other. They go to war. So these Marxism has exploded into a number of varieties. It has also been savagely, its credibility savagely undermined by the Stalinist experience and a lot of other experiences. Pol Pot. Appalling. And I think maybe even more frightening and as frightening in the Sendero Luminoso form if it comes to power, which I think it might. That's one. The second is, of course, the eruption back onto the world scene of dead ideologies like Islam. Part of the past, wasn't it? Not at all. Heavens alive, 12 European governments have just had to cut off diplomatic relations because of the Salman Rushdie book. The power of a regenerated, not authentic or traditional, it's not a fundamentalist continuity from the past. I think you and I might argue about this possibly. as it's a specific reading of Islam, and a very modern one, I think. The Quran does not say that government should be enhanced the mullahs, and etc., etc. But it's there, and it is an instance of at the most macro, transnational level of the persistence of deeply rooted, historically rooted cultural themes and visions, world visions. So I think my response to increasing resensitization back towards an anthropological interest in culture is a response not just very much to the conditioned by these huge changes in what's happening to large ideologies in the world, not just the small ones on Groot Island.
Can I just end, perhaps, since we've kept you so long, on two things. One is these sound like obituary type things, but what of the things that you've ever done, either writing or in action, do you feel, how shall I say, happiest or most proud or most fulfilled at having done one single thing?
I remember somebody, it was John Freeman, asking this question of Bertrand Russell, and he expected the answer writing a Principia Mathematica, and he said, my passionate relations with 3 different women. And I might almost say the same, but I won't, I'm not brave enough. I'm an intellectual, and I value intellectual work, and I value what I've tried to do, and so I obviously value the major things I've done, which is Trumpet Chaussin, Third World, 3 Worlds, and a number of other things too. And I'm proud of those, with all their shortcomings, and I hope I do some more, better. But, you know, as this long interview has shown, I'm a political animal. I guess always will be, though sickened by what's happened to the left. Nevertheless, I'm also extremely proud of what I think was probably a heroic phase in my political life, was the phase of the early formative years of breaking with Stalinism, but not just breaking with Stalinism, creating something new. We had that period of the creation of the new left, and the rise of CND, which was one of the most inspiring things I've ever known, and came back to a second coming a few years ago.
Yes.
And I'm happy to have been involved in that, played some role. Not just in universities.
Well, the other question, I suppose, is what, if other things had been different, what is it that you most would have liked to have done, and you may still do, but is the sort of avenue you didn't go down, which...
What do you mean? Well, there are all kinds of avenues one didn't go down. I can think of some. I was nearly forced with the position of leaving anthropology in Australia and having to earn a living, honestly. And I remember Ken Burridge was in the same position. He actually went to some interviews in business. And where are you going to earn a living as some kind of educated professional? It would be in public administration or in private sector. One might well have done that. I actually think I would have been quite interested. I find public bureaucracy absolutely fascinating, and I think the world of industry and business is also fascinating. I think I could have done that, though I would presumably try to remain very alienated from it, as a lot of people are who are in it. Including the whole of the labour movement. I think possibly too, if other things being equal, I might well have gone off, as so many people have done, and instead of pursuing an academic career writing about the Third World, try to do something in the Third World, like volunteers do, go and work for aid agencies and so forth. The great barrier or impediment to that is, of course, that in fact most of us are so saturated, involved in our own culture. We're married, we have relatives here, we have kids to bring up. We don't do it. That's what I mean. I'm very impressed by the number of anthropologists who go off and to the field in Borneo and Amazon and so on, and that is what one should be doing in one's life. Meet them 7 years later, and they're arguing that Rottenstall is a terribly interesting place in Lancashire, or southern Quebec, or some other place where they happen to be living at the moment. And why do they happen to be living? Because the kids are going to school there. And I've seen this amongst Dutch and Canadian and American and English, and to know that it is a pattern. That unless you're prepared to sacrifice the life of your children in our cultural terms, their educational career, which as we all know has got to start as fast as possible, then anthropologists suddenly start finding it absolutely imperative to study the West. And I think that is a bit of false consciousness.
Mm.
What does Sartre call it?
The last tiny question, have you ever been bored? I mean, you seem such a vital and interested in everything with enormous enthusiasm.
Well, I mean, there were long stretches in the army and, where one is, after all, confined to camp a lot of the time, doing routine and not very interesting things. But, yeah, I was bored, but luckily I was able to escape from them.
You were learning Swahili?
I was learning Swahili, or occasionally getting out to Nairobi, or talking to the Africans or something. Yeah, there were stretches of boredom, ennui.
But you certainly don't seem to be now.
Not since I left the army. Now, the army can be very boring.
The rest is fun.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, thank you very